Hi guys, welcome back to Carbohydrates Part 2. In this video lecture we continue on from our video lecture 1 where we talked all about simple and complex carbohydrates along with high and low GI and how that can affect the way we should probably choose carbohydrates during the general day and also around our training. In this part of our carbohydrate study we're going to start looking more about our eating of carbs around exercise and applying the principles of simple, complex, high and low GI carbs. We'll also look at the dangers of not having enough carbohydrate and what happens when you get too much of the wrong type. So we start on this slide here, GI and weight loss, and we've talked about how we can manipulate our knowledge of GI to choose carbs that are more suitable for different times of the day. But how does it relate to weight loss? So low GI foods typically will keep you fuller than high GI foods because they don't clear the gut so quickly. The sense of satiety remains a lot longer. So a slower digestion rate triggers that lower insulin response, prevents that sort of panic insulin response that causes the rebound hypoglycemia and hunger that comes along with that. So it gives you a more steady sort of supply of energy over a longer period of time. But based on the data that exists in the literature right now, it's not possible to conclude that if you just follow a low glycemic index diet that you're naturally going to be healthier or lose weight. And that's due to the fact that the two primary things that affect the GI of carbohydrates, other than their structural classification of simple and complex, is what's added to them. And because we don't generally just eat carbohydrates in isolation, then the presence of fat and protein can dramatically affect the release speed of the carbs into our bloodstream. So we have to consider that. So GI ranks carb-containing foods according to their effect on blood sugar and how quickly that happens. And we know that high GI foods give you a fast response in terms of blood sugar, and therefore we get that insulin panic, whereas low GI gives a slower release of energy. And people often talk about these foods as giving you more sustainable energy. And I guess that's true indirectly, because it clears slower from the gut, and because we don't get that associated insulin spike, it allows the glucose to travel to the muscles where insulin opens those muscle cells and essentially packs glucose in there for later, which means that you have more available for your activities later on. So yeah, I guess in a sense it does give you more sustainable energy. Post-exercise, we've talked about how the body has a high demand for glucose at that point, so the brain will allow high levels of blood glucose to exist for a short time because it knows that as soon as it circulates, the muscles are going to be pulling that in to replenish their glycogen stores. So what are the benefits of a high complex carb diet? It's important we hinge on that word complex, because the opposite of that is the one we see at the bottom here, which is a diet high in sugar, which is also a high carb diet, but not necessarily what we're after. Firstly, studies will show you that people that have more complex carbohydrates in their diets, and that includes obviously things like whole grains and fruits and vegetables, typically have better weight control. They would normally exhibit greater control over their weight and maintain a healthier body weight. We also see a lower incidence of heart disease in those that eat fibre-rich foods and reduce their fat and saturated fat in particular intake. There have been some studies that show that foods rich in some carbs, especially green and yellow veggies, protect against some forms of cancer. At this point, it's unclear whether it's from the type of carbohydrate, the fibre, etc., or is it from the vitamins and minerals that are contained within those, or a combination of both. More complex carbohydrates and less sugar usually results with less rate of diabetes because fibre delays that emptying, and therefore we avoid those glucose surges. And the presence of fibre also enhances the health of your gut. Stuff is shuttled through the gut a lot quicker. The fibrous tendrils of the fibre will scrape the walls of the gastrointestinal path and therefore stop food waste having too much contact with the colon wall. And there is some evidence that the longer food waste has contact with the colon wall, the higher your likelihood of developing polyps and then potentially a cancerous growth from that. Diets high in sugar, on the other hand, are a whole different ballpark. So let's have a look at that. The problem with diets high in sugar is that usually you bring into question the diet quality. Things high in sugar are not usually high in the key vitamins and minerals that we're looking for, and also the fibrous aspect is often lost as the refining process that looks to take the sugary centre from some whole foods is removed and just leaves you with the sweet and fast-releasing sugars. There's obviously links there with dental cavities, and it is one of the fastest way to lay down body fat by eating regular high amounts of sugar that the body has no demand for. So those high GI foods that clear very quickly are the most dangerous there. A lot of these high sugar foods, when they come in a manufactured form, often have high amounts of fats in them as well. So you get that double whammy of high fat, high sugar, and then often high salt, as the salt is used to balance out the sweetness of the sugar. Diets high in sugar have been indicated with heart disease. Unusually high doses of sugar alters your blood lipid profile, and we know when you've got a lot of fats floating around in your blood, then you're more likely to succumb to a heart issue. Moderate sugar intake has little to no effect, and there's this other one here, I enjoy this one, but there's no clinical evidence or scientific evidence to support this, but a lot of anecdotal evidence that suggests that high sugar intake is linked with criminal activity and in children, obviously, misbehaviour. So how are we doing as a country? Well, the daily average intake for carbohydrates in New Zealand is males around 280 grams and females around 210 grams. If we look at the spread here across the different age groups, here we see 15 to 18-year-olds, 19 to 30-year-olds, 31 to 50-year-olds, and then we get into the older age brackets and we see that carbohydrate intake decreases as they get older. That's good because most older people aren't as active as their younger counterparts. We see there's quite high sugar intakes here. When we say sugar, I'm going ahead of things here. We see not necessarily high carbohydrate intakes, but I can tell you that as a percentage of that, sugar plays a big part in this 15 to sort of 30 bracket here. And really that's the prevalence of these energy and soft drinks that are becoming mainstream sort of fluid choices now. So these are our most common choices in New Zealand. Bread is still a big player at about 17% for carbohydrate. Then other grains, pastas and non-alcoholic drinks, so that's your sodas and stuff, make up about 9%, but a higher proportion in the under 20s at around 14% of total intake. The spuds, kumaras and those kind of root vegetables, so they're quite starchy carbs, all make up just under 10% there. Just plain sugar and lollies about 7%, cereals about 5%, and then you've got cakes, muffins, milk, bread, milk and bread based products, things that you make bread out of, around 4% each. So a lot of these would be considered non-whole grain sort of sources. You know, the majority of the breads that we eat, the pastas and so on, are white flour based and quite high GI in nature. So are there problems with a low carb intake? Because more commonly now you hear about the emphasis on protein in diets. We need to fill up on protein and cut the carbs. Well, yes, some sectors of the population definitely could do with doing that. Those that don't want to work out or don't want to exercise should definitely employ a diet that's higher in protein and good oils than one hugely rich in carbohydrates. The bottom line is if you are active though, you need carbs, and basically by not doing that or by having a focus on protein as many athletes do, you end up with a lack of energy and a lack of available glycogen, which can then be converted into blood glucose or muscle glycogen for the purposes of exercise. So in athletes, the bottom line is if you run out of glucose during training, then you will cause a reduction in performance of the muscles. Okay, it's also associated with eating disorders. You often see this with very low body weights. You see that one of the first things people have really tried to cut out is their carbohydrate, which is an essential fuel for the body. It's the only fuel that your red blood cells use to regenerate. It's the only one that your CNS uses. So your brain needs carbohydrate to function. Eating less than 50 to 100 grams per day will force the production of glucose from protein. And that again is what we talked about earlier about using your own body stores of protein, your physical tissue, as a mechanism for fueling your body, which is never a great idea. Extremely low carbohydrate diets also inhibit efficient fat metabolism, and that can lead to something called ketosis. That's the production of some toxic compounds which have a negative effect on the brain and have been linked with depression and more than usual breakdown of essential body proteins. There's some brain damage associated there as well with these very, very low carbohydrate diets. So carbs is certainly not the enemy. Any athlete, and particularly an endurance athlete, any athlete knows what it's like to perform without carbs in their system, and it sucks. And there are many people that are under the illusion that if they don't eat carbohydrate or don't eat full stop before exercise, that they're going to create a double whammy effect in terms of fat burn. And it's simply not true. The blunt reality is carbohydrate is needed for any decent level of intensity exercise. And if you want to get results, whether it be performance or weight loss, you need to burn calories. The maximal calorific burn will occur with the highest intensity of exercise that you can maintain for the longest period of time. And a lack of carbohydrates will undoubtedly feel tough when you're working out. It'll be a tough workout and you'll feel like you're working out really hard, but if you actually look at the numbers, the actual wattage that you've maintained on your bike, the actual amount of weight lifted over the course of the session and volume maintained, the actual running speed that you've been able to maintain, and the actual calorific burn, you'll find that the numbers are much lower than those that are non-fueled. And when we talk about fueling here, we're talking carbs. Now, there is a raging debate going on in athletic circles and in the wider media about high-fat diets. And the people that are promoting the high-fat diets are elite athletes, elite endurance athletes. What they're doing is they're looking for a way, because they know routinely they're going to run out of carbohydrates in the course of their events, because they're doing these 2, 3, 5, 8, 12 and 24-hour type events. There's no way that we can keep up with carbohydrate demand. So they're looking for a way in which, when they know they run out of carbohydrates, that their body can utilize fat really effectively. But there's a huge difference between these people and your average population member. Okay, so a Lance Armstrong eating is massive. I'm presuming that's either a sweet pie, something like a lemon meringue or something like that. The huge advantage this guy has, or a fit athlete has, over the sedentary or normal population is that their bodies are finely tuned and have routinely become accustomed to running out of carbohydrate, and their body has recognized that there needs to be a secondary fuel source that is not just protein, because if this continues and we continue switching to protein, then we're just going to waste away completely. So it is possible to teach your body to be better at utilizing fat as a fuel source, and that's what we also want to achieve with our weight loss clients. It would make so much more sense to make your body a fat burner rather than a fat storer. The problem comes when we don't work out that much, and if we don't work out that much, our body is never going to look at fat as a meaningful fuel source, because we're not doing the volume of training that would force it to make adjustments. And when we get into the weight loss set of lectures coming up, we'll discuss this in some greater detail and give you some more meat on the bones of what we've just talked about there. So carbs is your rocket fuel. It's your petrol. The same way as a car needs petrol, your body needs carbs. If you wanted to put the foot down and get any meaningful sort of spurt out of your car on the open road, then you need petrol. The higher the octane, the better the result generally. So high intensity exercise relies on carbs. And as exercise intensity decreases and we go at lower intensities but go for longer, then we can start to access some of our fat stores. But most people don't or can't train long enough. You know, in the average population member, if they start doing aerobic-based exercise, it'll be a good 20 minutes before their body even considers breaking down fat as a fuel source. Whereas in the case of an elite athlete, their body might start to mobilize some fatty acids for fat use as a fuel source after the 2 to 3 minutes of activity, because they're routinely doing exercise for long periods of time and their body is expecting to go for long periods of time. Whereas your average punter who decides to start their new exercise regime leaves the front door and goes for a jog, and their body basically goes into shock. What are you doing? what is this? You're making me very uncomfortable running at the moment, and I know you're not going to do this for long, so I'm not going to bother trying to access this large store of fat that I have stored in me. I'll just break down these carbs, and when they run out, you're going to hit the wall, and it's going to be over in a matter of minutes. So this little diagram here shows the energy provision in a very simple form, and this is different for different people depending on what sort of engine you're running, whether you're an elite athlete with years of training behind you or a brand newbie. But essentially the principles are the same. Energy from fat. So energy supplied from fat typically occurs more when you're doing less, and that sounds great, doesn't it? It sounds like when you're sleeping you're burning almost all fat. However, the number of calories you're actually burning are completely minimal at this point here. And when you're working at top speed, when you're going 100 miles an hour, you are using all carbohydrate here. There's no time for that fat breakdown to occur to supplement that, so you're 100% carbs. And then what it shows is a sort of sliding scale that somewhere around here could be a 50-50 zone for you, where you can burn an equal amount of carbs and fat. And that's a nice zone that we want to focus on for particularly our aerobic type training. And if we look at this sort of 60-70% zone, this is generally where most exercise professionals would suggest that we try to conduct our cardio for maximal results. And that's number one, it's going to really challenge the cardiovascular system and cause some changes within the body. Number two, it is majoritively carb focused in terms of the exercise, because we are working at that intensity band that's well above 50% effort, but we're also burning some fat, and collectively as a percentage of a large amount of calories that we can burn in that sort of window of training, then we burn significantly more fat calories than we would if we're working down here at 30 to 40% intensity for the same period of time, even though the total percentage of calories burned as fat is going to be higher if we look at these low intensities. The total number of calories you burn over that same time period will be much lower. So, 70% from fat for 20 minutes of exercise and burning only 120, 130 calories is not as much as 30% coming from fat in a 600 or 700 calorie workout. So, we've got to find those optimal trade-off zones. Glycogen is the major source to convert the ATP for any activities lasting up to 90 minutes. So that's most sports that we're talking about there. We could look at that as a pure endurance-based sport like a cycle. Around that 60-minute mark, we're going to start depleting a little and maybe think about consuming some more carbs. But most sports are intermittent, meaning you're not working at those high intensities for the whole time. If your liver glycogen levels start to fall, they can no longer supply the blood with the glucose that the muscles are demanding, and then blood glucose falls, and unfortunately the muscles can't get the fuel they need, and then muscle glycogen depletion occurs. Continuous low intensity training, like a hike or something like that, you can go 2 to 3 hours of setting a pretty steady pace, because there's going to be a mixture of fat and carbohydrate used in that workout, and that'll help prolong your carb stores. But if you're going high intensity, about 15 to 30 minutes, you're going to see some glycogen depletion occur within the muscles, and that's going to mean that we need that constant supply coming from the liver, and it shows the importance of fueling before sport. If there's nothing there to replace the muscle glycogen with, then you're going to hit the wall, and your intensity levels are going to drop away completely. When liver glycogen stores are used up, you just can't keep your blood glucose levels normal, and when that drops, your brain function may also start to feel the effects of that. So now we're talking not only impaired muscle performance, but also impaired mental performance, and that's when mistakes start to come in. Once your glycogen stores are depleted at the muscle, an athlete can continue at about 50% of max intensity. So we've all been there, we've all been in a sport towards the end, we're out of gas, and we're just getting up and down. We're not able to put the foot down anymore. We're in that fun run, that city to surf, and we're just getting home, one foot in front of the other. There's no ability to race someone at that point or anything like that. The whole purpose now is just getting one foot in front of the other, and that's an indication that you've tapped out of your energy reserves there. So, with this in mind, anything lasting more than an hour of continuous type effort is going to probably need to consider carbohydrate replacement during the session. Okay, if you're only going for 30 minutes to an hour, it's usually not vital, provided that you've actually taken in enough carbohydrate in the pre-event window to fill your stores in the first place. This little chart here is quite a useful chart to consider. We'll put weight training on the back burner for a minute. We'll talk about that. It's got its own special sort of set of notes around this one here. But if we look at this, basically we're looking at the longer activity on the right here, 2-hour marathon, an hour's cycling, a basketball game, and 200-meter hurdles. This is by far and away the shortest and most high-intensity event. This has a good level of intensity, but is somewhat intermittent in terms of when you put the foot down and when you get a rest and when you sub. This is just a constant sort of cycle for an hour, sort of keeping that 70% heart rate sort of going, I imagine. And then this is a 2-hour marathon, which has to be run at a slightly lower intensity for most people, but for a longer period of time. And what you note is that carbs are in yellow, proteins in green, and red is fat. The most fat use in these 4 events here comes during the marathon, when of course we're going to run out of carbohydrates. What you'll also see is it's roughly a 50-50 split of carbohydrates and fat, and that will depend on the trained nature of your body. But if we're honest, how many untrained people are running marathons? These guys would have been out beating the streets before they tried to run 42 Ks. So there's a level of training that's gone on where the body has started to make the adaptation to using fat as a fuel source. So about a 50-50 mix there. And you also see the predominance here, or the growing reliance on protein. And that again is in reflection of the fact that you will run out of carbohydrates and your body will turn to protein as an energy source to get you across the line. When we think about that, that's physical tissue that we're using up. And of course, well, what do marathon runners look like? They're not muscle-bound guys, generally. They're usually very elongated muscles, very lithe and sinewy. And that's because we're basically relying on the muscle tissue that we have to get us through the race on a regular basis, which means even more important that we should ensure that we get enough carbohydrates in our system and make sure we take care of our protein needs post-training. For the cycle, it's done at a higher intensity, so we see more carb use, but of course, because it's aerobic in nature, we do see a decent amount of fat supplementing that carb use. For the basketball game, almost all the activity on the court is going to be carb-based, but in those periods of time where your heart rate returns to normal and subbed situations and stuff like that, you'll see the heart rate drop back and a little bit more fat use predominate there. 200-meter hurdles, pure carbohydrate. 90% carbohydrates used in that period, and this predominantly is probably in the immediate aftermath when the heart rate starts coming down. And then a weightlifting session, which has its own, it doesn't really fit in with this, but it makes sense when you think about this. Weightlifting sessions are usually pretty intense. So people are looking to be as effective as they can in the time that they have in the gym. But how much of the session is actually lifting and how much of the session is resting? And I think this sort of explains the percentage of carb and fat use there. This is the lifting. Maybe 40% of the session if you're lucky, if you're a good trainer and a really focused trainer and really watch your rest periods. And in most people, you would see even longer than that, so about 60% fat burning going on there as well when the heart rate comes back down to those lower intensities in between sets. So I guess worth noting, just on that point there, that carbohydrate is not going to be as important for a weight training session. It's still very important, but the total amount of caloric burn during a weight training session is usually much less than an endurance-based session or a sports session over the same period of time. And that's going to be reflected in the next little stage we do here, which is the calculations for carbohydrate needs. So what are your carbohydrate needs? That's where we're going to start. This little table here sort of explains the carbohydrate needs of most people here. So this is a slightly adapted table from the Sports and Nutrition Council of Australia and New Zealand, where I've reduced the amounts of all of these gram per kilo figures here by 0.5, and it's something that I just do routinely based on experience, that it generally comes out a little high on the calculations that they provide, because they're generally calculations for elite athletes rather than just your normal person. So how much carbs you get depends on how much exercise you're willing to do. These are grams of carbs per kilo of your body weight. There's a couple of provisos that will attach to this soon that will help you determine what you should pick. First thing you need to do is determine how many hours of meaningful exercise you would perform in a given week. So this will work out your average daily recommendation of carbs based on your average weekly exercise output. If you do less than 4 hours of meaningful exercise, you can give yourself 4 grams per kilogram of body weight. Now, if you're in a weight loss situation and you want to lose a significant amount of weight, let's say 5+ kilos of weight, then you should be using your desired weight rather than your current body weight. And that will help generate a greater caloric deficit, which should kickstart that weight loss there. If you're doing 4 to 6 hours of training a week, which is roughly nearly an hour a day, then you get 4.5 grams of carbs per kilo. 7 to 9 hours, 5.5, 10 to 13 hours, 6.5, and then 14 to 20, you're getting into elite athlete sort of status here. If you're getting upwards of 20 hours training a week, then you can start looking at these higher numbers here. However, if you are predominantly doing weight-based training, okay, so let's say you're in the gym 90 minutes a day, 6 days a week, and you're not doing any cardio at all, then you can dramatically lower this amount because, like I said before, the calorie requirements, particularly from carbohydrate during weight training, are nowhere near as high as those from cardio-based activities, as we showed you in the little graph on the page before. So, first thing, if you're doing about 50% of your sessions that you do during a week are weights-based, then you should take a full 1 gram per kilo off the figure that you've chosen there. So let's say you're doing 7 to 9 hours of weight-based training, and half of those are weights, then you would want to be taking this figure here and reducing it down to 4.5. If over 75% of your training is weight-based training, you can take a full 1.5 grams reduction off the figure that you chose. So let's say you're doing 6 hours of weights, pure weights a week, nothing else in there. You would take this here and it would drop back to about a 3. Okay, because once again, the calorie requirements from carbs of weight training are far less than that for a sport or for a cardio-based program. So an example here, Sally weighs 65 kgs. Sally trains 12 hours a week. Okay, what we would need to know is what she does, and I can tell you that she's an endurance athlete. She is doing basically 2 hours of running and cycling a week, triathlete. So she would get 65 kgs and times that by 6.5 grams, going back over here, 12 hours per week. She's right in the middle of this. She's an endurance-based athlete. She gets all of that. 6.5 grams a week would be 423 grams of carbohydrates per day that we're trying to get into Sally to make sure she's well fueled. And you can take a moment to try your one out. As mentioned, here are the considerations. Traditional weight training is considerably less calorie intensive than continuous cardio. Suggestion, reduce grams per kilo figure by at least 1 gram. So that's the average that we're suggesting you reduce. But like I say, if it's 50% of your training, 1 gram off. If it's over 75% of all of your training, you can go as far as 1.5 gram per kilo off. Do note though that circuit-based training or CrossFit training is more calorie intense than weightlifting, so you wouldn't be as aggressive with your reductions there if your training that you're doing has weights involved but is more circuit-based. That's a very high intensity type of training and would be considered alongside cardio-based training. We have to be aware that many athletes actually significantly undereat carbohydrates. They're under the illusion that more protein equals more gains. Now, if the results of these calculations you've just done shock you a little bit, or the person that you're working them out for, and you look at what they're currently eating and they're miles away from it, you certainly don't want to jump straight to that figure. Okay, that'll certainly put them off. You want to increase towards the calculated figures slowly over the next few weeks and prove to them that it works. Prove to them that A, they don't get fat, and B, that they have more energy and their performance results and training in the gym go up. And I can assure you if they are under eating, that will happen. Remember, if weight loss is desired, you can use desired weight in the equations to create a larger calorie deficit. Just be aware, or be sure that the goal weight that the athlete has, or the person has, is a realistic goal weight. You know, we don't want to get into a situation where you get an 83 kilo woman who says she wants to be 52, and you ask her, when was the last time you were 52? And she said, oh, I've never been 52, not even when I was a teenager. That's an unrealistic goal weight. Okay, so make sure people are operating off realistic goal weights before we do that. Okay, so when do we eat that? Well, we've already discussed that the key window really for fueling is in the 4 hours prior to training or competing. So we start thinking about carb intake in that 4 hour mark, and we might spread 100 to 200 grams of mainly complex carbs across that 4 hour period. Now that's quite a range, 100 to 200. It's going to allow for how big you are. A bigger person would be more towards the 200 and a smaller person more towards the 100. It's going to also depend on how intense the training is and how long the training is going to go for. So if you're just doing a 20-minute jog, no, we don't need this volume of carbohydrates. If you're doing a meaningful 1 hour or 90-minute match or something like that, you're playing football or basketball or something like that, then yes, you want to make sure you're in this zone here to make sure you have full glycogen stores when you hit that court. The closer you get to exercise, so if we're looking to balance this out and eat maybe a larger meal 4 hours away and something smaller within 2 hours, then the closer you get, you move towards more a mixture of low and high or low and medium GI foods so that it doesn't sit in your guts for too long. And best practice is probably if less than 1 hour before exercise, stick to liquids in terms of getting those carbs in. That's a practice thing. Everyone's different. Yeah, some people can tolerate food in their stomach close to an event, and some people can't. So you'll have to practice that with your training before you get into a competition format. During exercise, the only people who have to worry about fueling during exercise are those that are going to be engaged in exercise for well over that 1 hour mark. So if you are doing an endurance thing or a sport where you're well over the 1 hour mark, you may start to consider refueling. 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour after the first hour is the level of ingestion we should be looking for, and these should be high GI, easily absorbed carbs that are very low in fat and protein. You have a huge demand for carbs at this point, and you just need to get them into your body as quickly as possible. The easiest form is obviously fluid. You can use some easily absorbed bars, gels, etc. as well that are designed for this purpose. And then post-exercise. The big thing here is the post-exercise feed needs to be planned. And this is where people let themselves down. You should have access to this food almost immediately upon finishing training, rather than driving home, trying to cook something and snacking from the cupboards while you wait. 1 gram per kilo of body weight is suggested for carbohydrates, along with 20 to 30 grams of protein. And within an hour, typically will yield the best results as your system is still elevated in terms of heart rate and delivery, and we can get it to the muscles very quickly. Carbs and protein consumed together seems to best create the desired insulin response that we're after in this post-workout phase, and there's that high demand for glucose within the muscles at that point as well, so any type of GI is okay. You can use high glycemic foods, and this is where athletes often eat a few of the things that they're told not to eat at other times of the day, so maybe the lollies, the sports drinks, the white breads, the white rice, that kind of stuff. Personally, mine is Pam's cream rice, chocolate cream rice, 85 grams of carbs, high GI carbs in there, matches my needs perfectly. You also have the little readings at the end of your carb booklet or carb notes, and one of those is the Australian Institute of Sport findings on the stuff here. So I don't want to delve into this too much, but basically I just want to show you that the elite athletes at the Australian Institute of Sport, this is what they're given. It talks about how much they need. It's got grams per kilo that are broken down into different training phases there as well. You can see the stuff I've been telling you is actually relatively conservative. You look over here in general fueling up for events less than 90 minutes of exercise. You're talking 7 to 12 grams of kilos per kilo over the 24 hours preceding. So, they're pretty aggressive in terms of their carb fueling, and athletes know the importance of this. The glycemic index, a little bit on there, and when is carbs important, you'll see all of the things we've discussed in there. If you want to read through that stuff in your own time, you're welcome to. But the go-to things that I think are great to be able to pull out of these types of readings are just these examples. So these are all food portions that provide 50 grams of carbs. So when you're thinking to yourself, well, how do I build that 100 to 200 grams of carbs prior to exercise? How do I choose foods and know what's in, to make up my 1 gram per kilo post training? Well, here's a whole bunch of examples, from veggies to fruit to dairy products, that amount to 50 grams, and you start to get an idea of what's in the things you eat. Okay, so that's carbs, the first of our macronutrients dealt with. Our next step will of course be to go to our second macronutrient group, protein, and then we'll move into fat, and then we'll actually pause and put all the stuff we've learned together into a meaningful sort of set of rules for around exercise, and that one's called nutrition and physical activity. So I hope you enjoyed the lecture. Check out those supplementary materials at the back of your carbs notes in your booklet. There's a couple other readings there called the complexities of carbs and how GI is affected and those kind of things. And yeah, we'll see you for the next installment, which will be protein. Thanks for listening.